For a short period of time, the Indiana Pacers from 2012 to 2014 had a small window to win the championship. From top to bottom, those Pacers teams were very strong. They could compete with the other top teams in the league from either conference, and at one point, it looked like they were on the verge of doing something more. When we look back at that era, we connect it to Paul George because he was the guy who was supposed to take over the team. And for a while, that looked like it was happening. However, a couple of misfortunes, including a devastating leg injury, caused not only him, but the entire team to start over. So, what exactly happened to this team? Why was their window so short, and why couldn't they get it back together after 2014? How's it going, fellas? My name's Andy, and today we're gonna take a look at the Indiana Pacers in the early 2010s. But before we start, I'd like to give a shout out to my sponsor, Swagbucks. Swagbucks is an easy way to make some quick cash. All you gotta do is complete some surveys or play some games or watch videos. You earn points and then you can exchange your points for some extra cash or gift cards. Sign up with my link in the description below to get an extra $5 bonus when you take your first survey. Thank you again to Swagbucks for sponsoring this video. Alright, let's get started. Now, in my opinion, while most people think of this era as the Paul George era, I feel like it should be called the Frank Vogel era. Because the team started to gel and blossom when Vogel took over as head coach. That happened in the middle of the 2010-11 season. The former coach was Jim O'Brien, who led the Pacers to an underwhelming 17-27 record before he got fired. O'Brien did not lead the team anywhere. They missed the playoffs in the previous 3 seasons, although to be fair, the rosters they had were pretty bad at the time. But anyway, as Frank Vogel took over, he finished the season with a 20-18 record. At the time, the team was led by former All-Star Danny Granger, one of the best, most versatile scorers in the NBA. He was like a prototype version of Kevin Durant. The way he scored was so effortless because of his length and shooting ability. Granger had an incredible number of moves in his scoring arsenal, and along with great footwork, he was a tough guy to guard. At the time, he's been the Pacers' leading scorer for the last 4 seasons, and in 2010-11, he was still their leading scorer, averaging over 20 points a game. Along with a young Roy Hibbert and a rookie Paul George, the Pacers finished the season winning 37 games and surprisingly making the playoffs. Unfortunately, their first round matchup was against Derrick Rose and the Chicago Bulls. Although they lost in 5 games, it was actually a very tough series. In the first 2 games in Chicago, the Pacers had the lead for the majority of the time. Overall, in 4 of the 5 games, they were decided by 6 points or fewer. The following offseason saw some major changes to the Pacers. While Granger has always been the focal point and what other teams consider as the biggest threat on the team, they started to move away from that and instead began to develop a defensive identity. Coach Vogel was known for his hard-nosed defense, aggressive lockdown one-on-one defense, the style of play which he called smash-mouth basketball. The Pacers became an amazing defensive team, specializing in preventing teams from scoring in pick and rolls and drive-in kicks by staying in great position and intercepting passes. In the 6 years that Vogel was coach, the Pacers were always top 10 in limiting opponents' assists. In 2014, they were first in that category, and in 2015, even without Paul George, they were second. They were also a top 10 rebounding team in every season he was there. Defense and rebounding are what these Pacers teams thrived off of, and that became their new identity moving forward under Coach Vogel. Anyway, going back to the 2011 offseason, the Pacers made some key acquisitions. David West signed with the team. Just 2 years prior, he was an All-Star, but he was coming off a season where he tore his ACL. He recovered pretty fast though and was back on the court just 6 months later. Another acquisition was George Hill, who they got in a trade for the 15th pick of the draft, Kawhi Leonard. In hindsight, it was not a good trade, but the Pacers probably would not have drafted Kawhi anyway if they kept the pick. And George Hill turned out to be pretty good. He provided stability and leadership at point guard, which is what the Pacers needed. Along with the improved play of Roy Hibbert as he became an All-Star, the Pacers finished the lockout-shortened season with a 42-24 record. They finished in the top 10 in both offensive and defensive efficiency. In the playoffs, they defeated the Orlando Magic without Dwight Howard, and in the second round, they would lose to the Miami Heat in 6. At one point, it looked like the Pacers could compete with them, even having a 2-1 series lead before losing the series. However, it was clear that they were still nowhere close to the Heat. They didn't have the talent, and while their defense was good, their offense suffered because they didn't have a true star. Before the series, Vogel even made some comments about how he thought the Heat players were flopping like crazy, saying that every drive to the basket, they have guys not making a play on the ball but sliding in front of drivers. Oftentimes, they're falling down even before contact is even made. It'll be interesting to see how the series is officiated. Against the Heat, the Pacers as a team had an offensive rating of 99.2 and a true shooting percentage of 49.7%, which basically meant their offense was terrible. Their great defense did not make up for that, and unfortunately, as you'll see in the following years, their offense would always be their demise. Fast forward to the 2012 to 2013 season, and we saw another wave of changes. There were no major trades or signings or anything like that, it was all internal. Danny Granger was injured for most of the season, and when he came back, he was nowhere near his former self. The team now belonged to Paul George, who made his first All-Star team and was now leading the team in scoring. Lance Stephenson was already there for a couple of years, but now he started to get more playing time and became their new starting shooting guard. However, with Granger's absence, it was good and bad. The Pacers became the #1 defensive team in the league, but their offense dropped to number 20. They really missed Granger's scoring, and especially his three-point shooting, and at times throughout the season, their offense was very stagnant, with many games of scoring only 70 or 80 points. They did win 49 games this season, but it looked like they were going to have another bitter end in the playoffs, and that's exactly what happened. Even though the Pacers upset the Knicks in the second round and reached the Eastern Conference Finals, the Miami Heat were waiting for them once again. While this time the series went to 7 games and their offense was being carried by Roy Hibbert and Paul George, they still stumbled in Game 7, scoring just 76 points and getting blown out. The following season would be their best season of this era. The Pacers got off to a blistering start, winning 33 of their first 40 games, their best start in franchise history. But as the season progressed, they started to slow down. Now, from what we know, this was because of a couple of reasons. The first reason could be that they traded Danny Granger midway through the season, and coincidentally, the chemistry issue started at the same time. While Granger was no longer a star and barely got any minutes anymore, he was still the glue on the team. Losing him, from a basketball standpoint, it didn't matter, but everyone respected him and he held the locker room together. The second reason was that, apparently some players did not like each other. It was reported that Lance Stephenson and Evan Turner got into a fistfight. It was also rumored that Paul George slept with Roy Hibbert's fiancée, and that was apparently the reason why Hibbert's game fell off, although George did come out and say that this was just a rumor and not true. Regardless, the chemistry issues on the court were very apparent. In the second half of the season, the Pacers were a bottom 5 offensive team. There were just so many issues. Bad passes leading to turnovers, bad screens, players not rolling to the rim hard enough, and even defensively, they started to slack off. So after an incredible 33-7 start, they finished the season with a 56-26 record. Even though they were the #1 seed in the East, the team still had the same problems. Except this time, they would struggle for the entire playoffs, especially Hibbert, who recorded numerous 0-point games. Even in the first round, if it wasn't for David West saving the day, they would have lost to the Atlanta Hawks. They barely made it past the Hawks and the Wizards, and then once again, they lost to Miami. This time, the series went to 6 games, but it honestly was not that close. After losing to them for the 3rd time in a row, the team was dejected. The team was on the verge of imploding. There were times when George's leadership was called out and he never really had his teammates back. Frank Vogel said that it's bitterly disappointing to lose to the same team 3 years in a row, but we're playing against the Michael Jordan of this era. The aftermath of this season was brutal. Lance Stevenson was gone, Roy Hibbert was never the same again, everyone else was getting too old, and of course, during a Team USA scrimmage, George suffered that awful injury. Eventually, George would return back to his former self and lead a team that was very different than before. In 2016 and 2017, the Pacers returned back to the playoffs, but as the underdogs in the first round, they would lose in both years. After that, George was gone. That sums up the story. Those Pacers teams were very good and well-rounded, but the issues were never fixed. Frank Vogel was a great defensive coach, but offensively, he didn't have the game plan nor the personnel to handle the Miami Heat. The problem was that their offense was too mechanical and stagnant. It was too predictable and easy to stop, with a slow pace and very little off-ball movement. When George was younger, he showed flashes of dominance, going head-to-head against LeBron in his prime, but overall, he was even more inconsistent back then. Anyway, that's all folks. Let me know your thoughts on the Pacers during that era. Do you think it was the coaching that held them back, or were the players just not good enough to take the next step? Let me know in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time. Peace.